Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian. This year marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. In the past 4 decades, China buckled down to work and managed to become the world's second-largest economy. The United Nations Development Program, also known as UNDP, has lent a hand to China with a long history of collaboration. 39 years already. The UNDP has supported China through advisory and funding services, especially when China was just starting out. Recently, I sat down with Achim Steiner, the administrator of UNDP. He himself witnessed great challenges taking place in China over the past few years, and certainly the progress as well. In today's interview, he will talk about the milestones and the lessons from China's experience. Achim, as a close observer of China, what do you make of the real thing China has made it over the past 40 years?
What we in the world often see through the lens of economics is, however, far more. Yes, GDP has grown many times. People have become wealthier in terms of income per capita and households. But really the transformation of China is also one of urbanization, industrialization, maintaining a development pathway that also looked at urban and rural economy. I think from the beginning the desire, the commitment to not allow rapid development only to benefit the few, but to be inclusive, was part of the design. So the extraordinary number of people who were moved out of poverty and extreme poverty is part of that story.
China does not want to be the one that's saying, oh, you just follow me and then you will do as well as I do. And China didn't want either to say, well, I had some rich experiences, but I just don't feel like sharing with you guys. Yeah. But that's a very delicate balance in a way.
You see, part of the role and the mandate of UNDP is to connect development experiences. So we have obviously been invited into China in 1979 to help inform Chinese decision-making about development. Today, we are increasingly also drawing on China's own modernization concepts, just like we brought sometimes China into contact with, for instance, the concept of special economic zones in the 1980s, 1990s. Over many years, China has been drawing on international lessons learned, using it to design its domestic policies. Today, the China Council is also a platform for the world to draw on China's own experience. And I think, as you point out, no country should assume that its own development model is automatically applicable to another nation. Culture, history, geography, all of these influence national decision-making. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, and that is what good development, networking and learning is all about. Take the best of what others have found, adapt it to your own context, and find a national way to inform development choices.
And now we talk about anti-poverty. Of course, the poverty issue you see developing countries, emerging economy, even developed ones are facing right now. China has been doing with quite a successful record, one of a kind almost. But the question is, what's next? There are still a huge chunk, if you look at the peer number of it, of poverty in this country, despite of rapid development elsewhere in the country. And meanwhile, you also see that because of the national goal being set to alleviate poverty, there has to be not only a short-term achieving the goal, but also a long-term sustainable way of making sure the goal will forever be fulfilled. Thirdly, Achim, you know that while the country's wealth standards are raising, the poverty line is also raising. So there's always a goal of doing better. So you got a lot of layers of issues piled up. What about that?
I think you point to a very interesting issue, which is when we talk about development, sometimes economists have a way of defining a certain line that you cross, and then you are developed. Per capita income.
It's very automatic, mechanical even.
Exactly, which it is not. Development is about a constant set of choices and decisions that shape the future of our society. And so you never stop development, and you also want to particularly guard against falling back. And let me just give you 3 very brief examples that speak to that. In our experience, poverty eradication has indeed in China been extraordinarily successful. In many other countries also. India just now in the last 10 years has managed to lift over 270 million people out of extreme poverty. So this is a tremendous breakthrough. But what we learn is that 40% of people who escape poverty fall back into poverty. This is one of the very troubling statistics. Often, for example, by the absence of a health insurance system, because a crisis in health can cause you to lose up all your savings, which you will always do to protect your father, your mother. So we need to look also at poverty eradication as not only an income issue, but also establishing health protective schemes so that people are protected from actually falling back into poverty. Development is about a constant set of choices. It's a dynamic process, and sometimes it may be the unexpected that will cause major disaster. Last year's hurricane season in the Caribbean destroyed in some island nations the entire infrastructure. Basically, the country was destroyed overnight, and you have to rebuild. So these are the challenges of a constantly evolving development arena in which simple indicators are only pointers, but they're never the full reality.
How should we understand this debate about so-called definitions of developing country vis-a-vis emerging economies, vis-a-vis developed economies? How should we make sure they are not going to hinder us from doing the real work?
You point to something that is, I think, increasingly troubling all of us in a world where simplistic indicators
labels
and labels that come with it also, and groupings and interest groups that form around them do not necessarily match reality, both in terms of what has changed and also what it implies. I mean, if you take China 40 years ago, in terms of its total GDP, was smaller than the Netherlands, and today it is the second largest economy. Clearly the China of today is not the China of yesterday. We are not trying to use indicators and statistics to differentiate alone. We're actually trying to find a fair means of cooperation. Much of what the United Nations does and much of what our multilateral system does is provide the basis around which countries with different interests, different histories, different development status can come together to cooperate. And I think in UNDP, to me, this is one of the guiding principles. In the year 2018, we don't need to look at the world only in terms of per capita GDP. Some of the greatest threats in terms of, for instance, health, pandemics, climate change, extreme natural disasters, perhaps poverty and the associated emergence of extremism are actually happening in middle-income countries. The largest number of the world's poor do not live in LDCs, least developed countries, but in the middle-income countries of this world. So our role as the Development Programme of the United Nations is to be a partner in assisting these countries, advising them, supporting them in how to manage these transitions.
The drastic changes in geopolitics are complicating the agenda of the UNDP. Such change is exemplified by cases such as the 7-year-long Syrian conflict, a regional conflict that has evolved into a clash between the US and Russia. Also, the South China Sea issue that has raised tensions among China, the US, and various Southeast Asian states, the re-emergence of right-wing politics in South America, and the fracture of the European Union, and so on. In this context, the UNDP must find a way to carry out its mission while protecting its independence.
When you think about the United Nations Development Program, many of the current issues that it needs to deal with also need a very united international community. Unfortunately, these days, you see some countries' priorities are moving away from the global priorities, and yet these countries could be termed, quote-unquote, significant. So from your perspective, could that be the reality for the future, or probably even more as we go?
We need to distinguish between understanding the driving forces of what is happening in individual countries right now, which are the product of a complex set of developments. Sometimes the disappointment with what was promised and was not delivered. The sense of a loss of sovereignty perhaps over your local life. The extreme inequality in wealth that is creating in a society a sense of unfairness, perhaps weaknesses in political leadership. So in each country these come together and they produce, clearly in many countries now, a degree of political polarization and even extremism that often translates into nationalism, inward-looking reactions. The question is, how can leaders both respond to these and at the same time not destroy the very fabric and the system that we have built up over many decades, a system that was born out in the sense of multilateralism, rules and norm-based cooperation. We have too much to lose right now to let those national tensions, in a sense, undermine our capacity to work together as nations. We have to always correct. We should not be complacent. Our international system has not delivered everything it promised. But at the same time, if the national perspective begins to be the driving and dominant one, I think we will undermine our capacity to not only work together as a community of nations and soon with 10 billion people, we will paralyze our capacity to deal with pandemics, with cybercrime, with extremism, with climate change, with migration. These are just a few examples of how we are destined to work together and to cooperate if we are to manage these challenges.
You see the changes of geopolitics these days. It is adding pressure to everything that we are working on and talking about. So how will UNDP, for example, doing development programs, be able to free yourself from the chains of geopolitics? I'm sure that is one question that you have to think about almost every day.
This is not the first time that we face a world with divisions. And I think the first departure point of multilateralism is always that it actually has been given a mandate. There are principles that govern us, and it is the community of nations that has established those principles. In the year 2015, in this remarkable moment, when the world in the General Assembly adopted the so-called 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, it was almost against the politics of the day then, that people said, look, our future is predicated upon our capacity to work together. Development, sustainable development, is no longer an issue of the rich countries giving to the poor countries. We have a universal agenda. We can always compete in markets, we can compete with ideas, but we cannot compete against the future, against each other. And that is why the idea of multilateralism at this particular moment in time is not less relevant, as some would say. It may be more contested, but it actually is more important than if everybody was in agreement right now.
Related to that, about the funding for the SDG to be fulfilled, you got $1 trillion hole there. You think about all these important projects that are really having a huge impact on the individuals you are working with, and the enormous hole that you have over there about money. How to reconcile?
You rightly point to it. Governments cannot finance these transitions alone, irrespective of whether you're a rich, developed country or developing nation. So a great deal of attention is now put onto private capital and private finance, because the world currently has about $300 trillion worth of wealth. Our role as UNDP is to help governments look at what kind of incentives do we create in the financial markets of tomorrow to attract private sector investment. It's not as if we are inventing this for the first time. Private sector has invested in healthcare, in power generation, in public transport systems, in water supply systems. So what we have to do is create an economy in which private capital can invest in the delivery and the impact of sustainable development goals while also making a return on investment. It's not to privatize our economy. I think this is the big lesson we learned in the 90s.
It's a different thing.
It's
a very different thing.
But the private sector also today knows that the sustainable development goals is actually about achieving a more stable future, a more predictable environment, a more resilient market in which they can operate. So investing, in a sense, your private capital in a worthy investment while also contributing to impact on the Sustainable Development Goals is a win-win proposition, but we have to create the right conditions.
Lack of trust is also one of the biggest problems. There has been quite some amount of skepticism arising over the past few months about the Belt and Road Initiative, the idea itself. That is an interesting case study in a way, because the world does need a lot of fresh ideas. But on the other hand, people tend to be more skeptical about ideas rather than thinking solutions. As the UNDP, how do you read these phenomena and adjust?
From a perspective of a United Nations Development Program, First of all, the commitment of China to engage in the development of other countries is to be welcomed, and the Belt and Road Initiative is a very significant financial commitment to supporting the development of particularly developing nations. And development is a complex process. It's not only a matter of putting money into a project. It is about learning lessons, about financing, about inclusiveness, about macroeconomic policies. And I think we are probably in a phase where, irrespective of some of the geopolitical debates, China itself is examining how can it learn lessons, how can it evolve its own Belt and Road Initiative. And here UNDP is one of the world's premier partners in helping countries look also at how their support to other countries can deliver maximum impact, maximum benefits. And I think if we understand these two as related but distinct tracks on the Belt and Road Initiative, it is easier also to understand what moment we are moving in.